I never thought the day we buried my father-in-law would be the day my marriage ended too. But that's exactly what happened, and honestly, looking back now, I think he knew it would. His name was Clifford. He went by Cliff. He was the kind of man who fixed things. Leaky faucets, broken fences, broken people. He had this workshop in the back of his house in rural Ohio. Smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and he'd spend entire Saturdays out there just tinkering. I used to sit with him out there on weekends, handing him tools, listening to him talk about the town he grew up in, the people he'd helped over the years, the way he believed a man's worth had nothing to do with his bank account. I was 28 when I married his daughter. I'm 32 now. Those 4 years feel like a different lifetime. His daughter, my wife, her name is Viveka. I want to be fair when I describe her because I know I'm not a neutral party here. She's sharp, talented, the kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately understands the social architecture of it, who has power, who wants it, who's pretending not to care. She used those skills for good sometimes, and then sometimes she didn't. I'm a carpenter. I build custom furniture, mostly. Cabinets, dining tables, bookshelves for people who want something that lasts. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't come with a title that impresses people at parties. I make a decent living, enough for us to have a small house, take one vacation a year, save a little. When I married Viveka, I thought she understood what she was signing up for. Maybe she did, once. I think something shifted in her after her mother passed, 3 years into our marriage. Grief does strange things to people. It clarified something in Viveka, not warmth but hunger. Cliff had built a modest empire quietly over 50 years. He started as a general contractor, saved obsessively, invested in commercial real estate across 3 small Ohio counties when the land was cheap and nobody else was paying attention. By the time I came into the family, most of that land had tripled in value. He never talked about it directly. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He bought his clothes at the same hardware store he'd been going to since 1987. But the money was there, and eventually Viveka started doing the math. She never said it outright. She was too careful for that. But I noticed the way she started asking her father questions. Casual questions at Sunday dinners, slipped in between the bread and the pot roast. Who handles your accounts, Dad? Have you talked to an estate planner? What happens to the land if something happens to you? Cliff would answer briefly and change the subject. He was polite about it. But after those dinners, driving home, he'd get quiet in a way that told me he'd noticed too. The last year of his life, Cliff was dealing with a progressive heart condition. He didn't dramatize it. He took his medication, reduced his hours, hired a part-time helper for the property. He asked me one evening, just the two of us in the workshop, him sitting on his stool, me leaning against the workbench, if I'd be willing to drive him to his medical appointments when he couldn't drive himself. He said he'd pay me. I told him not to be ridiculous. We shook hands anyway, because that's how Cliff formalized things. I drove him twice a week for 7 months. Some mornings it was early, 6:30, dark outside, both of us with coffee in the truck barely talking. Other times he'd be in a mood to talk and we'd cover everything. His childhood, the town, the way he'd met my mother-in-law at a county fair, how he'd worked 3 jobs the first year of their marriage so she could finish nursing school. He talked about legacy a lot toward the end. Not money. Legacy. The difference between what you leave behind and who you leave behind. Viveka knew I was driving him. She didn't offer to come. She said she had a demanding schedule. She was working in pharmaceutical sales at the time, and that I had more flexibility. That was true, but it was also true that she found those appointments uncomfortable, found the whole reality of her father's decline uncomfortable, and preferred to engage with it through logistics rather than presence. She handled the pharmacy pickups. She organized the filing system for his medical records. She was efficient, she just wasn't there. When Cliff passed, it was a Tuesday morning in late February. I dropped him off the Friday before, helped him up the porch steps, made sure he had everything he needed. He squeezed my arm before he went inside. He said, "You're a good man. Don't ever let anyone talk you out of that." I didn't know those would be the last words he'd say to me. I've thought about them every day since. The funeral was 4 days later. It was a small service. Cliff had wanted it that way. Viveka wore a white dress. I remember noticing it and thinking it was a strange choice, but I didn't say anything. She stood at the front of the room like she was hosting an event. She greeted people efficiently, accepted condolences with a practiced expression, and steered every conversation toward the reception afterward. When I put my hand on her shoulder during the eulogy, she shifted slightly away. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. Cliff's attorney, a quiet man named Aldous Fenn, who'd been handling Cliff's affairs for over 2 decades, called us into a conference room on a Thursday afternoon. Viveka sat across from me at the table with a legal pad and a pen. I didn't bring anything. I hadn't really thought about what was coming. I was still just thinking about that Tuesday morning, about the porch steps, about the ways his hand had felt on my arm. Viveka had assumed, I think, that Cliff's estate, the land, the properties, whatever cash and accounts existed, would pass to her as his only child. That was the natural expectation, that was the logical outcome. She had the legal pad ready to take notes. Aldous Fenn opened the folder. The estate was valued at approximately $4 million. It wasn't $500 million, but in rural Ohio, for a man who drove a 10-year-old truck, $4 million was a fortune. Viveka got the house. The primary residence where she'd grown up, a well-maintained 4-bedroom on 2 acres, worth about $300,000. She also received a cash disbursement of $50,000. The rest, the commercial properties, the land holdings, the investment accounts, went into a charitable trust. The trust had a director. The director was me. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then Viveka said quietly, "I'm sorry, can you read that again?" Aldous Fenn read it again. The trust was structured to fund small business loans and vocational training programs in the 3 counties where Cliff had built his portfolio. The idea, written into the document in Cliff's own deliberate language, which Aldous read aloud, was to give back to the communities whose land had made him wealthy. The trust was to operate for 25 years. As director, I would receive a modest annual stipend for the administrative work. The decisions about where the money went, which programs to fund, which applicants to approve, those were mine. Viveka stared at the table, then she looked at me. The expression on her face was something I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, more like the moment right before anger, when the brain is still catching up to what the body already knows. "You knew about this," she said. "I hadn't. I genuinely hadn't known. I'd suspected Cliff was up to something with his estate planning. The way he'd occasionally ask me abstract questions about what I thought made a community strong, what I thought fairness looked like. But I hadn't known. I told her that. She didn't believe me." Aldous gave us a moment and stepped out. Viveka gathered her legal pad, stood up, and said, with a steadiness that scared me more than shouting would have, "When you get home tonight, your things will be in the garage. I'll have my attorney contact yours." She walked out before I could say anything. I sat in that conference room for a while after she left. Aldous came back in and asked if I was all right. I said I wasn't sure. He nodded like that was the correct answer. He told me Cliff had updated the trust documents 8 months earlier, around the time I'd started driving him to appointments, and that Cliff had been very deliberate, very clear, and very certain. He said Cliff had told him, "My son-in-law understands what this money is supposed to do. My daughter will be fine. She has her mother's house and enough to start over. What I need is someone who won't forget the point." I drove home that night to find 3 duffel bags and a box of books on the garage floor. The house was locked. My key still worked, but there was a note on the kitchen counter, typed, not handwritten, that said her attorney would be in touch and that she'd prefer I not contact her directly. I called my brother. I slept on his couch for 2 weeks. I kept driving to the workshop in my mind, the smell of it, the sawdust, Cliff on his stool, both of us with our hands around coffee cups. The divorce moved quickly, which surprised me. Viveka was efficient in everything she did, including leaving. We had a prenuptial agreement, something her father had actually suggested when we got engaged, which had felt awkward at the time, but now felt like one more thing Cliff had quietly gotten right. The agreement protected my business assets. The marital home went to her. We split the joint savings. It was clean the way surgery is clean, precise and painful and leaving marks you carry forever. 4 months after the funeral, the trust became fully operational. I set up a small office in a rented room above a hardware store in Millhaven, one of the 3 counties in Cliff's portfolio. I hired a part-time coordinator named Josephine, a retired school teacher who knew everyone in the county and had a gift for identifying which grant applications were genuine and which were optimistic fiction. We started reviewing proposals. The first loan went to a 23-year-old named Dewey, who wanted to start a mobile auto repair service for elderly residents who couldn't get their cars to a shop. The second went to a woman reopening a diner that had been the center of her town for 40 years before she'd had to close it during a rough stretch. The third funded a welding apprenticeship program at the county vocational school. None of these made the news. None of them were glamorous. But every time I approved one, I thought about Cliff on his stool, talking about legacy. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I did, I heard Viveka's voice, quieter than I remembered it, something tentative in it that I'd never heard before. She said she'd heard about what I was doing with the trust. She said her father's former neighbors had mentioned it, that people in town were talking about it. She said she'd spent the last several months rereading his letters. He wrote letters, actual paper letters, to people he cared about, and that she'd found one addressed to her that she hadn't opened until recently. She didn't tell me what it said, but she asked if she could meet me. We met at a diner in Millhaven. Not the one the trust had helped reopen, a different one, quieter. She came in without the legal pad. She sat down without the practiced expression. She looked tired in the way that honest grief makes people look tired, which is different from the way exhaustion does. She said, "I think I misunderstood what he was trying to teach me." I didn't say anything. I waited. She said she'd been thinking about the white dress. She said she'd worn it because she'd read somewhere that some cultures wear white to funerals as a symbol of peace. And she told herself that was why. But sitting there, 6 months later, she thought maybe she'd been performing something. Performing the idea of herself as someone who had already moved past it, already fine, already on to the next thing. She said she didn't know if she could explain it better than that. I thought about what Cliff had said on the porch. Don't let anyone talk you out of that. I thought about whether he'd said it knowing I'd need to remember it in a moment exactly like this one. I told her I wasn't angry. That was true. What I felt was closer to sadness, a clean kind, the kind that comes after you've already done the harder work of processing the sharper feelings. I told her I thought Cliff had loved her. I believed that completely. I thought the trust, the way he'd structured it, wasn't punishment. It was an invitation. He'd given her the house she grew up in. He'd given her enough to be stable, and he'd left the rest of his life's work to someone he trusted to carry it forward, with the implicit hope that she might eventually want to be part of it too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if there was anything she could do. For the trust, she meant. She had a background in sales and relationship management. She knew how to talk to people, how to build connections. She thought maybe she could help with outreach, finding businesses and programs that needed funding but didn't know how to apply. I told her I'd think about it. I did think about it. For about 2 weeks, I went back and forth. I talked to Josephine, who said, with the directness of a retired school teacher who has zero patience for unnecessary complication, if she can help the people we're trying to help, then she helps. That's the only question that matters. I called Viveka back and told her she could come to one of our quarterly review sessions, see how that process worked, and we'd go from there. She came. She was prepared, genuinely prepared, with notes and questions and a list of 3 organizations in the 2nd county she'd already identified as potential candidates. Josephine raised an eyebrow at me across the table. I kept my expression neutral. We are not reconciled, Viveka and I. We are not friends, not exactly. What we are is 2 people who both love the same man and are trying, in our different ways, to honor what he was asking for. Some days that feels like enough. Some days it feels like the hardest thing I've ever done. I still work as a carpenter. I still build things with my hands. On weekends sometimes I drive out to the old property. The house is Viveka's now, but she's let me use the workshop. And I sit on Cliff's stool, and I try to think the way he thought. Slowly, carefully, with a long view. There's a quote he used to write at the bottom of his letters. I found it in the stack Viveka eventually shared with me. It said, "A man's real estate is the space he makes for others." I'm still learning what that means. But I think I'm getting closer.